Good morning or afternoon, and here we go for another story time. So, where have we got to? Remember, they heard something. We're walking along and they heard something, and that's all we know. Chapter 60. The Hunters. Crack! A gunshot echoed through the mountains. There weren't many hunters willing to trek into the wilderness, but those that did were serious. They camped out with camouflage and fired traditional rifles for the sport of it. Crack! Roz and Brightbill were desperate to stay clear of the hunters. However, that was proving difficult. The trees were tightly packed together and the undergrowth was tough and tangled. So they followed the deer paths that cut through the parts of the forest, but they never knew where or when the next shot would be fired. Crack! The gunshots were growing louder. Our friends slowed to a crawl, afraid of being seen or heard, and then the chatter of forest animals fell silent. Crack! A bullet whizzed through the undergrowth and a deer went bounding away. At the same time, birds screeched and flapped into the air. Unfortunately, one of those birds was Brightbill. Scared and confused, the young goose fluttered up the tree limb just as two hunters emerged from the bushes. "What's a goose doing alone in the mountains?" said Hank, staring up at Brightbill. "And what's he doing in the tree?" "There must be something wrong with it," said Moogle. "Maybe we should put it out of its misery." Hank reloaded his rifle. "We're here to hunt deer," he said, "but it looks like we're having goose for dinner tonight." Had the hunters known Brightbill the way we do, readers, I'm sure they would not have left him alone. But they knew nothing about him. To them, Brightbill was just another goose and a meal, and they were getting rather hungry. The hunter raised his rifle. He took a deep breath. His fingers reached for the trigger, and then a fierce gust of wind suddenly blew across the forest floor. No, not a wind. Footsteps. Something was stomping towards the hunters. Their rifles were whipped away, bent into hooks and thrown aside. The men had hunted all manners of beasts before, but they'd never come across this. They didn't know what this thing was. It looked like a tree stump, standing on two long roots, with branches hanging from its side. The men stumbled backwards, with eyes and mouths open wide. They then turned and ran, and their terrified noises trailed off through the leaf litter. The goose was terrified too. He slumped off his branch and into his mother's arms. The poor bird was trembling with fear, but he was unharmed. "I am so sorry, Brightbill," said the robot. "I should have acted sooner. You are now safe, I promise." Chapter 61. The Guide. A light drizzle was falling on the travellers, although they weren't actually travelling at the moment. They were standing still and staring up at the steep mountains of rocks. The robot had plenty of rock climbing experience, but one bad fall out there and she could be stranded forever. So Roz carefully picked her way up the slippery slope, while Brightbill fluttered along beside her. They hadn't gone far when there came the sound of hooves clattering on stones, and then a horned creature leaped from the mist and smashed right into the robot. Clang! Roz went flying backwards. Clang! Roz crashed on the ground. Standing on the rocks above the robot was a wild ram. He had big curling horns and a crazed look in his eyes. Brightbill flew to his mother's side, ready to defend her. "Step away from my mama!" he hissed, spreading his wings. But rather than charging, the ram hung his head and started to cry. "Oh, I'm so sorry," he blubbered. "I don't want to hurt anyone. Sometimes I just lose control and smash things. I feel awful about it. I really do." Roz brushed herself off. "I believe those are your instincts," she said. "We all have them. They can be very powerful. I only hope your instincts do not end up breaking me." "Don't worry," the ram sniffled. I will try not to let my instincts break you. I appreciate that, said the robot. My name's Thud, said the ram. Which way are you headed? We are trying to find our ways out of these mountains, said Roz, but they seem to never end. You're almost there, said Thud. Let me show you the way. It's the least I can do after smashing you. The ram pranced away and led our friends to a narrow path that wound up the rocky mountainside. Roz tried to stay close, but Thud was a born climber. He easily scrambled up the steep slopes and vanished into the mist. A minute later, his friendly voice called out, For a creature without any hooves, you're not a bad climber. And there he was, peering down from the cliff edge. The path opened into a foggy meadow where the whole flock of wild sheep were grazing. They reminded Roz of the cows grazing in the pasture, and she wondered how Hilltop Farm was doing without her. Thud pranced through the flocks. These are my new friends, he announced without stopping. They're lost, so I'm guiding them out of the mountains. The sheep raised their heads. Thud had a habit of making weird friends, but these two were definitely the weirdest yet. The flock watched as the ram, the robot, and the goose continued up the mountain and disappeared into the mist. Higher and higher they climbed above the tree line, to where there was only rocks and scrubby plants and trickling mountain streams. They occasionally came upon a dirt road or a hiking trail, and the ram trotted across casually, whilst our friends crept cautiously across. At one point, the ram got that crazed look in his eye again. His horns came flying at the robot and she jumped out of the way just in time. Then Thud cried and apologised for his instincts. Roz forgave him and the group carried on. Then finally, hiked up from the mist and onto the mountain ridge. Above, the sky was clear. Below, a blanket of puffy clouds spread outward in every direction. The sun was setting and the western clouds were burning pink. That's the new friend. Roz thought of the mountaintop on her island. If only she could be watching the sunset from that peak instead of this one. But they still had a long, long, long way to go. Thud pointed our friends to one last path. This will take you down from the mountains and through the foothills, he said, smiling. The ram suddenly got that crazed look in his eyes again, and the robot prepared to jump. But this time, Thud pulled himself together. He said goodbye to the travellers, and then he pranced away. Chapter 62. The Showdown. Daybreak in the foothills and thick grey fog was everywhere. With such poor visibility, the travellers relied on their other senses. They smelled salty air. They felt sandy soil. They heard seagulls screeching and waves breaking. And then they heard a long, low note of a ship's horn. Hum! Somewhere in the distance, hidden by the fog, was the ocean. As if to answer the ship, there came another long, low note. But it wasn't a horn, it was a howl. A wolf was following our friends. Brightbill beat his wings and squawked, Mama! Run! Roz ran downhill, deeper into the gloom. Her feet stomped on sandy soil, leaving behind the trail of footprints. There was no time to hide her tracks. She just kept running. Blurry shapes faded in and out of the fog, and her eyes darted around to see if there were rocks or bushes or wolves. But the robot should have watched where she was going. She slipped and thumped into the sand, and before she could get up, Shadow was on top of her. We thought we got rid of this one. The wolf was heavy and strong. He pinned Roz to the ground and locked his teeth onto her tool belt. At last he had caught his prey. Violently, wildly, he thrashed the robot from side to side. Roz tried to squirm free, but Shadow's grip was so tight. There was only one thing to do. She reached down beside the wolf's snarling jaws and fumbled with the buckle, and suddenly she was loose. Shadow staggered backwards, the belt dangling from his mouth as Roz stomped away. Brightbill had been circling overhead the whole time, and now he squawked desperate warnings to his mother. Look out for those rocks! Shadow is gaining on you! There are the buildings ahead! Roz burst through the row of hedges and onto the main street of a seaside village. It was still early and it was still foggy, and Roz was halfway through the village before anyone saw her. A man had just left for a morning walk when the robot and the wolf came galloping down the street. Imagine seeing that stepping outside your house. The man decided his walk could wait, and he hurried back inside. Shadow swiped at Roz's heel, but the robot leapt away. She soared over the house and landed on the other side. The wolf dashed around the yard, only to see her leaping away once more. This time, Roz had landed in shallow water. Waves gently sloshed against her ankles. The robot backed into the ocean, up to her waist, and then automatically stopped. Her survival instincts would not let her go any further. "There's nowhere left to run," Shadow growled as he prowled onto the beach. "Either fight or swim." Roz was trapped. Her body lurched forwards and backwards as her computer brain struggled to find an escape. Then Brightbill came to her rescue. "This way, Mama!" Roz didn't hesitate. She launched herself up from the shallows towards her son's voice. Salt water streamed off her body as she soared through the air. Then her feet pounded onto the sand beside Brightbill, who was perched atop of an old robot. By the time Shadow arrived, our friends were rowing away from shore. The wolf's face twisted with rage, and he howled from the water's edge. "You made a fool of me, Roz. My pack and my mates have left me. Now I'm just a worthless lone wolf, all because of you." Roz felt sorry for Shadow, but she never meant for any of this to happen. But she had her own troubles now. The robot's greatest fear was deep water, and now she was paddling through the waves and out to sea. And we're going to stop there.